במהרה בימינו שייבנה, במהרה בימינו שייבנה, שייבנה המקדש. לא עליך המלך לגמור, לא עליך לגמור, לא עליך המלך לגמור, לא עליך לגמור, ולא אתה בן חורי להיבטל ממנה, ולא אתה בן חורי, ולא אתה בן חורי להיבטל ממנה, ולא אתה בן חורי. שייבנה בית המקדש, שייבנה, שייבנה בית המקדש, שייבנה, במהרה בימינו שייבנה, במהרה בימינו שייבנה, שייבנה המקדש. לא עליך המלך לגמור, לא עליך לגמור, לא עליך המלך לגמור, לא עליך לגמור, ולא אתה בן חורי להיבטל ממנה, ולא אתה בן חורי, ולא אתה בן חורי להיבטל ממנה, ולא אתה בן חורי. שייבנה בית המקדש, שייבנה, שייבנה, שייבנה בית המקדש, שייבנה, שייבנה, במהרה בימינו שייבנה, במהרה בימינו שייבנה, שייבנה המקדש, שייבנה המקדש, שייבנה
Good afternoon and welcome to Congregation Anshe Torah's Scholar in Residence program. My name is Robin Feldman and I'm the Director of Programming and Member Engagement for the Shul. Thank you for joining us for our Lunch and Learn program today with Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer. Before we begin, I just wanted to go over a few items which you can expect during today's session. All participants will remain on mute throughout the program. If you would like to submit a question for Dr. Kurtzer, please use the Q&A function found at the bottom of your screen. The usual chat function will be disabled for this event. If you would like to use closed captioning, please click on the CC button found at the bottom of your screen. Please note that this is a service provided by Zoom and includes automated transcription. During the program, if you are having any technical difficulties, please email me at programming@anshetorah.org and we will work as quickly as possible to resolve any issues. Don't worry if you miss any portion of today's program as we are recording and it will be available on the Anshe Torah YouTube channel. Again, thank you for joining us today for today's Lunch and Learn with Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer. Representing our Near Tamid sponsors, Debbie and Manuel Razhanov, please welcome our host for this afternoon, Manuel Razhanov.
Thank you, Robin, and good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to today's Scholar in Residence 2022 Lunch and Learn session. This year, we mark the 11th anniversary of Congregation Anshe Torah's Scholar in Residence, honoring the legacy of Arnie, a beloved and learned leader of the Dallas Jewish community for many years. Of course, we would not be here without the generous support of all of our sponsors. Thank you for once again supporting this signature event and for enabling us to bring in such phenomenal speakers year after year. Special thanks go out to our presenting sponsors and for their ongoing and enthusiastic support. Janice and Art Weinberg, Cindy and Mitch Moskowitz, and Kathy and Joel Brook. Now on to our speaker. Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer is the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. He is a leading thinker and author on Jewish history, Israel, and the questions of leadership and change in American Jewish life. Among his publications, we have Shuvah, The Future of the Jewish Past. He's also the co-editor of the New Jewish Canon, a collection of significant Jewish ideas and debates of the past 2 generations. And he is a host of the podcast, Identity Crisis. Our Q&A facilitator today is our very own Rabbi Weinberg. Rabbi Weinberg established Congregation Anshe Torah in 1988 and has led our thriving community ever since. His life's passions and blessings was building our shul and providing opportunities for congregants to deepen their roots in the tapestry known as Judaism. Rabbi Weinberg is a past president of the Rabbinical Association of Greater Dallas and co-founder of the Dallas Jewish Coalition of the Homeless, and served as secretary and treasurer of the Southwest region of the Rabbinical Assembly. Today's Lunch and Learn is a continuation of the theme of this weekend, a free people in our land, Jewish in America in 2022. Today, we will be treated to an inspiring discussion on the transformations of American Judaism between revolution and evolution. We will take a deep dive into the changes in American Jewish life and how might we design a Judaism and a Jewish community that can thrive in America today. Like I mentioned, Rabbi Weinberg will be moderating the Q&A towards the end of our session. Without further ado, I'll turn the program over to Dr. Kurtzer for today's teaching. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Manuel, and thank you to everybody involved, to the rabbi, to the lay leaders and the sponsors and the professional staff. It's been wonderful so far to be with you last night and to continue this conversation today with so many people taking your lunch break to study a little bit of Torah together. What I want to do today is explore what I think is one of the central category errors that I think we as an American Jewish community have been engaged with a long time in trying to sort out the changes that have been transpiring in American Jewish life over the past 2 generations. And to process the significance of those changes in order for, as Manuel said in the introduction, in order for us to be able to design a serious Judaism, a serious set of Jewish communal institutions that can actually respond in a more sophisticated and serious way to what it means to be an American Jew today. And the central category error that I want to talk through is that we as Jewish communal leaders, I put myself in that bucket, we as Jewish communal leaders have treated the series of changes that have overtaken our Judaism as lived and practiced here in America over the last 2 generations. We have treated them as evolutionary changes when they are in fact revolutionary changes. That mistake, that error, has long-term consequences, because when you're actually living through a period of revolutionary change and you treat it as evolutionary, you assume that all you need to do is to make small changes along the way, incremental changes to respond to these trends, and you always feel as though you are catching up to the trends. I speak to rabbis all the time as part of my work, and until I kind of figured out this diagnosis, I couldn't figure out why so many rabbis and Jewish communal leaders always felt like they had whiplash. That as soon as they kind of figured out the newest change in the dynamic of the kinds of issues that I'm going to talk about today, as soon as they figured it out, the Jewish community had moved beyond them. And part of that, I want to argue, is because, again, we are thinking about revolutionary change as evolutionary. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons why we might be inclined as Jews to think about evolutionary change. After all, our Jewish people has managed to travel thousands of years throughout history through significant changes, geographic and ideological. We have managed to survive the passage of time while generating a sense that we have a sense of continuity, right? We are an extraordinary people in that we think of ourselves as the same people as we are. We think of ourselves as the same people today as were our people 500-600 years ago, who believed different things, engaged in different practices, spoke different languages, and lived in a different part of the world. And that's because we've made an art of the notion of evolutionary change. It's always uncomfortable when someone comes along and says, no, we want to do things radically different than Jews have done before. Our people has, for valid reasons, repudiated those kind of leaders. We have a category for them that's called false messiahs. We don't trust when people come along and say, we need to stop doing things the way we've done them before and do them totally differently. And I say that so that we can be generous to ourselves in understanding why it might be that we are treating the surrounding environment that is America as the product of evolutionary change, as opposed to noticing quite how dramatic these changes are and how significantly they're altering our sense of our Judaism. I mentioned last night when I was talking about the history of the American Jewish community that we are also a community with extraordinary continuity. We've been here for a long time without the massive political disruption, a major political event that would force us to reckon with totally new realities. Again, that's a means of being generous to ourselves. This is why we are inclined to think that we are living through a pace of slow change. I'm going to argue today that on three major fronts, what the American Jewish community has been doing for the last 2 generations has been evolving in an incredibly rapid pace in ways that feel sometimes overwhelming. And in order for us to be able to respond more seriously and in more sophisticated ways to really articulate what is our place here in America, to continue what I talked about last night, to really articulate what an authentic American Judaism can look like, we have to take these changes much more seriously on their terms as actually revolutionary transformations that require our attention. I've divided them into 3 categories. I've helpfully alliterated them for our benefit today. The three transformations, revolutionary transformations of American Judaism I want to talk about are in the realms of identity. Who are we as Jews? Ideology. What are we collectively committed to? What do we stand for? So one is who are Jews, or who are the Jewish people? The second is what is Judaism? And the third is infrastructure. What are the institutions in which Judaism is and will be perpetuated and practiced here in North America? Great. What I'm going to do is share my screen now so you have the source material. Yeah, I believe it was also circulated in advance. If you need a copy, you can please let us know. Hold on. Okay, hope you can see that okay. I want to tell 3 stories. The first says, once upon a time, Jews in America understood some notion of Jewish identity as being fundamentally different than that of Gentiles of non-Jews. And equally important, Gentiles, non-Jews understood this distinction as well. Why is that important? It's important because it's one thing for a Jewish community that wants to think differently about the transformation of its identity. It's another to be presented with social circumstances in which we're allowed to probe and push past that notion of our difference and our separateness. If you look at the first source that's here, one of the classic rabbinic ideas about Jewish identity, one that has stuck around for a long time, is this idea that Jews are the technical term is ontologically or fixed in terms of our identity. Another way of saying it is that Judaism has long time thought of itself as Hotel California. You can check at any time you like, but you can never leave. Once you have become a Jew, there's nothing that can happen that can strip that Jewish identity away from you. A Jew is a Jew is a Jew. The rabbis say in Talmud and Sanhedrin, responding to the idea that the Israelites have sinned. Based on other religious traditions, sinning or doing terrible things might actually eliminate your status as a member of that faith community. And Judaism has insisted that no, Jewish identity is something very, very different. It's something that locks you in place permanently. Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda says, even though the people has sinned, they remain Israel. As Rav Abba goes on to say, thus people say a myrtle, though it stands among reeds, is still a myrtle and is so called. If you listen to the message of this text, Jewish identity compared to non-Jews is something that not only it can never be eliminated, there's nothing you can do, you cannot convert out of our tradition. This is long way we have thought about this for a long time. But not only can you not convert out of our tradition according to classical Jewish sources, but the difference between a Jew and Gentile can be exhibited in similar ways as a myrtle among reeds. We're all plants, we're all human beings, but there's something fundamentally different about the Jew in a way that suggests that you might be able to fit in periodically, but you're ultimately something of a different species. You say this out loud in the North American Jewish community, and that terminology is uncomfortable. Wait, really? Are we so different on a human level? I would say in the middle of the 20th century, the prevalence of structural anti-Semitism, which was still quite significant in America, lower numbers around intermarriage, a more awkward social and political position for Jews in America would have corroborated. This is the essentially what was similar in the American Jewish story would have been correlated to the way Jews experienced a Jewish identity at other times in our history. One good piece of evidence for this is a short comedy routine that some of you might be familiar with by the comedian Lenny Bruce. By the way, Lenny Bruce is making a comeback now as a minor character in The Marvelous Mrs. Maisels. Lenny Bruce is an important text for our purposes. Used to give various versions of this routine called Jewish and Goyish in New York comedy clubs in the 1960s. I excerpted one of the most famous parts. Kool-Aid is Goyish. All Drake's cakes are Goyish. Pumpernickel is Jewish. And as you know, white bread is very Goyish. Instant potato is Goyish. Black cherry soda is very Jewish. Macaroons are very Jewish cake. Fruit salad is Jewish. Lime jello is Goyish. Lime soda is very Goyish. This is a text that is incoherent unless it makes total sense to you. That the world can be divided between Jews and Gentiles, and not in some scientific sense. Bruce is not talking about Jews believe this and non-Jews believe that. That's not funny. What's funny about this, and I'm sorry to ruin a piece of comedy material by treating it as a Jewish text. What's funny about this is that Lenny Bruce is tapping into a truth that was much more deeply felt by American Jews in the 1960s than it is today. That I can describe Jewishness as a form of social otherness without reference to anything that we actually believe in. There is a difference between a Jew and a Gentile, and it is as easily mapped as the difference between pumpernickel bread and white bread. I will tell you anecdotally, as we bridge from the past to the present, when I have taught this text to young Jewish American college students, not only do they not understand it, but they are, as you might expect, offended by it. Wait, you're making the claim that to be Jewish is to be kind of essentially other? Or are you saying to me, this is even worse, it's one thing if you say Jewishness provides you with moral or spiritual thickness and richness, but the food that I have to eat at my grandmother's house, that's what defines me as a Jew? That's really what's supposed to set me apart? Doesn't this sound as though it's preserving a kind of ethnocentrism that lacks a serious moral foundation? I know this is just a comedy routine, but the larger story that we have been engaged with in America is not just that American Jews are doing things like intermarrying or assimilating. That reduces a social phenomena to simply a set of behaviors. The much larger story here is that we as American Jews are engaged in an incredible social experiment of eliminating the very barriers, eliminating the gap between Jew and Gentile as being largely meaningless to most American Jews, and at times the attempt to reinforce that boundary is perceived as being offensive. Shia Cohen, my teacher from Harvard, writes in this beautiful book, The Beginnings of Jewishness, the major difference between our world today and theirs, that is of ancient Jews, is that the existential contrast between us and them was a reality for the Jews of antiquity, even for pre-rabbinic Jews or non-rabbinic Jews, where it is not a reality for many contemporary Jews of the diaspora. The majority of the Jews of the United States, perhaps the vast majority, do not feel alienated from Gentile society, and our society does nothing to reinforce Jewish identity or to compel Jews to remain Jews. There's no sign that any group of Jews in antiquity, I'm skipping ahead, ever attained this level of integration in our societies, this level of acceptance and ethnic self-abnegation. And he goes on to ask a powerful question that is implied by the loss of this anchor of Jewish identity as some form of social otherness. Jewish communal leaders wonder and worry, does the disappearance of the other portend the disappearance of the self? Without a them, can there be an us? If there's really no difference between Jew and Gentile, well, increasingly, all of the advantages or the necessities of belonging to an us start to disappear. If my goal is personal thriving, then maybe I thrive better through normalcy than a story of exceptionalism that's implied by a notion of Jewish identity as separateness. There's so many statistics and examples. All of our households as Jews are massive social experiments of breaking down the distinction between us and them, all of us. But here's an incredible statistic. In about 2012, the New York Jewish community did a population study, as our Jewish communities usually do. I love population studies because they're proof to the evolution or evolution problem. By the time you get the data on the population study and you feel you understand who the Jews are of your community, it's 5 years old. The data is obsolete, but we do it anyway because we got to try to figure out how to keep pace with all of the trends. Anyway, in this particular population study, they found that 5% of people who self-identified as Jews in the New York area, 1 in 20, full 5%, did not convert to Judaism and had no Jewish parents. I want you to pause on that for a second. Had no Jewish parents and didn't convert to Judaism. So how is it that 5% of people who self-identify as Jews are not by any legal definition Jews? What would make them self-identify as Jews? Well, maybe it's because they've married into a Jewish household. Maybe, right? That seems like the obvious place, right? They belong to a Jewish household, even though they themselves never crossed the boundary to become a Jew. Of course, the bigger lesson here is that it's not obvious that to become a Jew is a boundary that needs to be crossed. It's no longer obvious for Jews in America that to exit my Judaism involves crossing a boundary either. What this forced the creation for us as American Jews of a totally new category of Jewish identity called voluntary affiliational identity. I find this in my travels across the North American Jewish community. There's a whole bunch of people in our communities who simply decided, I want to be part of the Jewish people. And if you're not going to accept me in your congregation, I'll bet I could find one that will. I want to pause for a moment and name quite how extraordinary this phenomenon is in the history of Jewish identity. In almost every Jewish community in which we've lived, even in places where there were, for instance, high numbers of intermarriage, there were still enough social controls in place that Jewishness constituted its own separate identity. You could tell maybe the difference, not based on appearance necessarily, but some way where Jews lived, how Jews behaved, to mark Jews as somehow different and other. The first revolutionary story that we are engaged with in the American Jewish community is the total obliteration of social, ethnic, and political barriers between Jews and non-Jews, forcing a big question for us as Jews of who are we? Second story I want to tell. Once upon a time, Judaism in America could have been described in reference to a term that, again, I'm borrowing from the ancient world, called common Judaism. I'm not saying that all Jews in America ever believed the same thing at the same time. We have always had deep differences of opinion as American Jews about what's most important in our Jewishness and what we believe in. However, I think it's fair to say in the middle of the 20th century that there were things that you would be able to say Jews hold in common, not necessarily of things that they do together, but that they would ascribe as what would make up a serious Judaism. Throughout Jewish history, common Judaism has been defined by two different approaches. One might be, how would I describe what we as Jews hold in common? You might name things that Jews do, behaviors. In the ancient world, for instance, the Jews were known as the people who abstained from pork. It doesn't mean that all Jews didn't eat pork. It's just that from the perspective of non-Jews, they didn't say Jews looked a particular way, but they knew that Judaism kind of was defined by a certain set of behaviors. You could, again, be a violator of those behaviors, but even in the act of violation, you're acknowledging that a Jew doesn't eat pork. Or as the rabbis say in Leviticus Rabbah, for 4 reasons were the people of Israel redeemed from the land of Egypt. What did Jews do in order to maintain their corporate identity? As a group living within a foreign society, they didn't change their names, they didn't change their language, they didn't spread malicious gossip, and they were free of sexual licentiousness. A different version of this text says they didn't change their clothing. I love this text because it's never been true. The first thing that Jews do in every civilization is change our names and change our language. But I like the text because it's an imagination text that says there are things that you have to do. This is not the same as identity. These are things you have to do to signal that to be Jewish is to be associated with a certain set of ideas that everybody can say that is Judaism. Or perhaps, as Maimonides writes, what makes a Jewish community? Showing up, participating in some of the collective enterprise of what the Jewish community is about. Maimonides has his incredible lesson, which he says, a person who secedes from the congregation, even though he commits no transgressions, doesn't do anything against the Torah, but doesn't show up, remains separated from the congregation of Israel, observes no commands with them, does not include himself in their troubles, nor afflict himself on their fast days, but does what the rest of the people does, has no share in the world to come. This is a great example of, I can't really punish this person. They're not under my thumb anymore to punish. What I'm saying to you is, the way in which you belong to the Jewish people is through the act of belonging. Mordechai Kaplan used to say that there are basically three ways for Jews to participate in Jewish life: believing, behaving, and belonging. And you hear those are the kind of raw materials of a common Judaism that I think was far more prevalent for North American Jews 50 years ago than it is today. In fact, you might even say those very things that American Jews would have said are the ideas or commitments that we hold in common: a belief in Jewish peoplehood, broad support for the state of Israel. Those are the very things today that we as a Jewish community are most likely to fight about. They're still important to us in some ways, but it's very hard to imagine that there would be anything you could describe as being a majority opinion, as being part of a common Judaism. Find a form of heresy or a passion or a behavior, and I bet you could find Jews in America who would say, not only do I do that, but it's my Judaism. By the way, COVID is accelerating this, because the great equalizer in terms of what is Judaism in the public square is digital, is on the internet. The ability to have any social control through our institutions, we'll get to more of that in a second, that defines what Judaism is for a particular era, is broadly disappearing. If the first revolution we looked at is around the question of what is a Jew, or who are the Jews, the second major revolution that we are living with here in our time is that the common Judaism, made up of a couple of ideological commitments that we hold in common, has fallen by the wayside. I am not sure, say this as straightforwardly as I can, I'm not sure that there is any single commitment that the overwhelming majority of Jews would describe as holding their Jewishness in common that we would think would actually be thick enough to constitute a common Judaism. Whenever they do the Pew studies, the things that get the highest rankings are things like, yes, it's important as a Jew to remember the Holocaust. It's important as a Jew to have a sense of humor. Are those the raw materials of a serious ideological Judaism that can actually build community? They feel paper thin to me. So the third major revolution I want to suggest that we've been underway and living through, and as I've learned, your congregation is still a relatively new congregation, so you are part of this revolutionary shift as well. In the middle of the 20th century, the American Jewish community designed an extraordinary infrastructure to solve for their needs. That's, by the way, why institutions get created. Right? All institutions, Jewish or otherwise, get created because human beings have fundamental anthropological needs. We need some sort of infrastructure to provide us with community. We need institutions that provide us with basic needs. We need institutions that provide us with meaning and purpose. And so a group of people organizes together and builds an institutional infrastructure that solves for their basic needs. If you fast forward today, it's very obvious to anybody who works in the Jewish nonprofit landscape that the institutional infrastructure designed by 1940s and 1950s Jews for their needs is on no planet the institutional infrastructure that you would design in 2022 for the needs of the American Jewish community. Nevertheless, it was built so magnificently and so majestically that it's not so easy to transform the institutional landscape from its needs at one time to its purposes for another. There's too much baggage laden into our institutions. And there's a fundamental, what I call the fundamental tragedy of institutions. An institution is born to solve for fundamental human needs. And then instantly, if you sit on a board of an institution, you know this. Instantly, the minute any institution gets created, its mission changes overnight. From solving for the needs for which it was created to doing whatever it needs to do to survive. Past 30 or 40 years, much of the Jewish communal landscape has been in survival mode, trying to figure out how does it provide meaning and purpose to institutions that would not be the ones that we would create today. I'll give you a couple of examples. In the conservative movement, the denomination that was the largest American Jewish denomination in the middle of the 20th century, 30% of conservative synagogues have closed their doors in the past 40 years. That is a really big number. That is a story of revolutionary transformation of one of the core denominations of American Judaism. Or perhaps, if you prefer thinking about the money side of Jewish communal life, American Jews in the early part of the 20th century invented the federation model. We did so because our social position was more precarious, and we did what immigrants do, which is build networks of mutual aid. We pooled our philanthropic capital to create stable and vibrant Jewish communities. By 1985, more Jewish communal wealth was in private family foundations than was in the federation system. That is nearly 40 years ago. Once that happens, the whole construct of a federation has to change. We're no longer acting through the framework of our collective philanthropy. We have all effectively decided to withdraw from it. John Wucher described what American Jews built to build our infrastructure in the 1950s as an American Jewish civil religion, an institutional ideology, right, that unified Jews across denominational and organizational boundaries. And he goes, I'll read from the middle of this text. He says, civil Judaism responded to a desire on the part of many American Jews to give their Jewishness a larger significance and to do so in terms that allowed for but did not require elaborate theological affirmations or religious observances. It's a long way of saying what we know is true. American Jews belonged to synagogues in a huge way in the 1950s, but believed in God less than Jews do today. So what were those synagogues about? He says, that Jews moved to the suburbs in the 1950s and rushed to build synagogues in order to fit in well with our church-building Christian neighbors, but were uncertain about the content with which to fill those synagogues. Jewish civil religion provided the content, a religion of support for Israel, for social justice, and for preservation of the faith, right? And a set of alternative avenues, some more compelling than the synagogue from which to practice that religion. This is a little bit of common Judaism, right? That's what Jews held in common in the 1950s, the need for our own institutions, a religion of support for Israel and social justice broadly construed, not in the polarized political way in which we use the terminology in 2022, but broadly speaking, supporting the state of Israel and repairing the world as dominant ideas for 1950s Judaism within a set of institutions that worked for the landscape of what American Jews needed out of their institutions in 1950s. What happens when you inherit a map of institutions that no longer fundamentally serve your needs? Some of them go through complicated and painful processes of going out of business over 20 and 30-year periods. Some of us have been talking about what would it look like to pool all of the infrastructural resources that the Jewish community has at its disposal, billions of dollars of real estate, and actually figure out how to reallocate it for its needs. But nobody does that. There's a famous example, local to me at least, of a synagogue that has been dying very slowly over a 40-year period, while other more dynamic Jewish organizations with young people and new types of services, renewal, and other types of religious expression are renting space in church basements. Something bizarre when you can no longer correlate between what your institutional infrastructure is and what the Jewish people actually need. There's a whole bunch of historical reasons why we've gotten to this place. But it's very clear to anybody involved in the Jewish institutional map that you would never design the infrastructure that the Jewish community designed in the 1950s for a Jewish community today, and that it's unbelievably difficult to try to bridge the gap between those two. 3 major revolutions and so much data that could be piled on to help reinforce this story. The first revolution, a revolution of Jewish identity. And by the way, each of these in and of themselves could take hours of our time to play out all of the consequences and all the implications. The revolution of Jewish identity is not merely in Jewish households, it's also in the American public square. Jews are characters on television shows in which their Jewishness is no longer a novelty. In the lead up to the 2016 presidential election, you had 3 finalists, Clinton, Trump, and Sanders. Regardless of who had won that election, the president would have had Jewish grandchildren in the Oval Office. And as a result, Jewish identity is no longer litigated in the public square as something of significance. Nobody talked about it in a debate. Can you imagine in the 1960s when Kennedy is president of the United States and his Catholicism is a question of, is this okay? Is it okay for us as an American country to have a Catholic president? Can you imagine a Jew running for president in the 1960s? By the time you get to the Joe Lieberman candidacy in 2020, Jewishness has moved from being something socially marginal to possibly a social commodity. Lieberman becomes explicitly and publicly proud of his faith as a marker not of some way of questioning his Americanness, but because it's a good, Jewishness is a good way to be American. We have lived through an unbelievable revolution in our lifetime around the very question of Jewish identity and what it means to be a Jew in America. The second revolution on ideology. Were there things that we held in common as an American Jewish community? Support for Israel, the fight against anti-Semitism. The last great moment of Jewish collective participation in anything was the battle against the Soviet Union on behalf of Soviet Jews in the late 1980s. That was a perfect case for us as a Jewish community to be organized because it meant you get to be in the middle of the Cold War against the Russians. The Soviet Jewry struggle, it was our local equivalent of being in Rocky IV. The big bad Russians, and we Jews were part of the American project of liberating our own people and defeating the commies. There remains very little that would actually organize a Jewish community as being something that we could collectively define as part of a shared project, something that we would all describe as being essential to a common Judaism. And it's certainly no longer, we could go into more detail on this, it is certainly no longer the state of Israel, which divides us now more than it unites us, nor the battle against anti-Semitism, which, as we know, has become a partisan discourse here in America. And third is this revolution of infrastructure. Simply put, the infrastructure designed for 1950s Judaism is not the infrastructure that we necessarily need for 2022. Let me conclude by offering a look forward. I think these 2 diagrams give us a kind of a little bit of a map of the fundamental difference between what it means to be a Jew in a pre-modern age and what it means to be a Jew today. There has always been tremendous biodiversity in the core commitments of what it means to be Jewish. Always. The fact that we were surrounded by ideas that held us together, ideas like anti-Semitism, that which is imposed on us by others, or chosenness, the inverse, the way we think of ourselves as different. Or if we're united by political structures like ghettoization and the lack of political autonomy, forces us to be together with other Jews, even if they have radically different ideas about what it means to be Jewish. One of my favorite examples of this is in the 1910s on the Lower East Side. The anarchists used to set up banquet tables in the streets on the morning of Yom Kippur. I love that. They did so to antagonize their neighbors who were religious Jews. So you have religious Jews and you have political Jews, but they all live in the same climate. They all live in the same place. At this point, if you want to not be a religious Jew anymore in North America, why would you live in the middle of the same community where religious Jews live? Absent those structures, right? Something else is going to happen. If you look at the bottom slide, we are living in effectively a boundaryless age, where all of these different expressions of Jewishness as something that is ethnic in nature or cultural or communal or religious or national are proliferating and developing in ways that are totally separate from one another. Their codependence is no longer obvious. Two thoughts about what we have to do as American Jews in response to this. One big takeaway for all of us is we are going to have to invest in thickness. If Jews in America can be Jewish in whatever forms they want, religious or cultural, and they don't have to cross paths with one another, we have to make all of those pathways as robust and strong as they can be. We have to allow for the proliferation and development of new forms of Jewish identity that stretch beyond our own limited expectations of what we think Jewishness is. And the second big takeaway of all of this is we are going to have to figure out a new strategy for Jewish pluralism. If Jewishness is going to mean something in North America, but we are pulling apart in such profound ways from one another, and if we believe that there is something gained from being able to define us collectively as being involved in a shared enterprise, we're simply going to have to work much harder as a Jewish community to shape and define what that's supposed to look like. Most of all, however, today, my objective was to use these windows, identity and ideology and infrastructure, to signal that the pace of change that we are involved with in Jewish life is much faster than the one that we are accustomed to as a Jewish people, and to start preparing us for communal conversations in the context of synagogues or in larger communities to say, what is the Jewishness we want to curate and create to respond to these extraordinary circumstances that America has brought on the transformation of the Jewish people? Let me stop there and turn it over to you, Rabbi Weinberg. I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments.
Thank you, Dr. Kurtzer, so very much for that enlightening look, deep dive into where we are as a Jewish community today. And gosh, you've touched on so many different aspects that define us today. And I know that there are a couple of questions that I have received that I'd like to turn to. But if I may I ask the first question?
Please.
The question I guess I find myself asking is, the question is sort of defined by, I think, a term that makes contemporary Judaism to a certain extent feel very uncomfortable. What is authentic Judaism? And what is, not that I want to necessarily define it that way, but it has to be a part of the discussion. This commitment to a more, what we typically call traditional expression of Judaism. How we as a people have historically passed on our tradition from one generation to the next. And if we have this total disappearance of boundaries, of there's so little that really can, that we're able to put our finger on that will define what is a Jew. This balance that we attempt to identify, the balance between particularism and universalism, it seems like the only place where we can find true Jewish expression that relates to generations past is in the more traditional element of our community, which recently has experienced such significant growth. And I guess I would love to have you respond to that a little bit in light of these comments that you have shared with us about the rest of the Jewish community trying to, if you will, find its soul.
Yeah. So In the last couple of months on the Identity Crisis podcast, I did 2 episodes that were trying to get at exactly this question, because there are much of what I described today is about the whiplash that I would call liberal Jewry has been experiencing, right? Of wow, how do I hold on to the thickness of these commitments when essentially the open porticos of the American project feel like it's like a steamroller on Jewish identity? There are other experiments underway in America, right? One of them is Chabad.
Right.
Now, Chabad is widely understood wrongly as being like traditional and countercultural. The Lubavitcher Rebbe may have been the first Jew who really understood America. If you read the writings of Lubavitcher Rebbe, he understood that in order to compete in the marketplace of American ideas, what you do is compete. You don't wait until alternatives have emerged. You get out there, you get in people's business. You separate, for instance, this amazing thing this Chabad guy said, Rabbi Mordechai Lightstone said, he said, I don't really care about identity. I care about Jews doing Jewish things. I would like them to gradually do more Jewish things. When someone stands at the street corner trying to get you to put on tefillin, the goal is do a Jewish thing. In the American context, that's exactly American thing. You stand in the public square, there's something capitalist about it. There's something about the marketplace and choices and being available. So number one, notice that Chabad is an American project too. And by the way, it's the other great American project, which we interviewed David Myers and Nomi Stoltensberg last week about their new book about Satmar. The Satmar Hasidim, they argue, are an American project because they understood that America makes possible a type of religious liberty for minority communities who want to live as separatists. Satmar is no different than the Mormons. And if you make use of the American project to cultivate American Jewish identity, you can actually flourish. I think the challenge for us as liberal Jews, right, is to not paint those guys as being anti-American. It's to understand that they're using the same raw materials of the American project to actually flourish, to make possible a Judaism that can survive here. There's something about both of them. I don't think it's about tradition versus not tradition, Rabbi. I think it's about confidence versus not confidence. I feel my Jewish communities are always on the defensive. Always anxious about the criticism, incapable of articulating like a vision for what it means to stand confidently in the American Jewish public square and to say, I hold on to a serious set of Jewish commitments, even though I transact and traffic with this society very differently. That's what I'm looking for. And I wouldn't say I've figured it out yet. It sounds like you're working on it too. But that's what we're trying to grasp at, because neither of us wants the idea that we have to somehow be morally retrograde. We don't want that. Nor do we want to insist to American Jews that they have to reject all of the opportunities that are available to us as America, that we have to live in enclaves. We don't want that. But something has to give around something has to be generated around our ability to say, no, Jewishness is a source of pride. It's something that we own, and that we're not nervous that by living in the public square, it's going to be eroded away from us. That's what I feel we're missing a little bit.
Well, thank you. I hope we can continue to strive to get there, to arrive at that place. And right now we see these, I think, as you acutely identified, 2 extremes between the Chabad and Satmar and liberal Judaism. And of course, we in the conservative movement are squarely in the middle.
Always in the middle. Yeah.
Let me share another question with you. We've seen our grandparents fight in World War II, and they became assimilated American Jews, all to fit in. It didn't work, as we still had to create the Federation, the JCC, our own summer camps, etc. They tried to get away from their religion only to find that's ingrained in our souls. American Jewry is fragile. And you just spoke about confidence. And our American freedoms and Jewish teachings make us difficult. May we fight amongst each other. We may fight against each other, but the outside world still doesn't like or accept us. How much thickness do we need to keep developing until we bust at the seams?
I'm just not sure I agree. I think it is true that at least my grandparents' generation, the World War II generation, definitely operated against a larger culture of Jewish separateness, Jewish difference, a pervasive anti-Semitism. But I think that there's pretty good data to show that the American Jewish community accelerated fast into the American milieu much faster than anybody anticipated. The way I like to see it is American Jews started the 20th century in the hope of assimilating. Jews have always wanted to assimilate. This is Gerson Cohen, who's the late chancellor of the seminary, a magnificent essay called The Blessing of Assimilation in Jewish History. He says Jews have always wanted to assimilate. The only difference about the American project is it has been allowed of us. The reason why Jewish day school education and JCCs and Jewish choices, the necessity of synagogue belonging, that dissipates because it's no longer required of us. In Los Angeles, there are two country clubs. There's the Los Angeles Country Club, and there's a country club called Hillcrest. Hillcrest gets created by Jews in the middle of the 20th century because they are not allowed to participate. They're not allowed to belong to the LA Country Club. So you have this weird feeling. I've been there recently. It's a Jewish space, but you can't quite figure out why. Right? There's nothing Jewish about it, right? You can order bacon in the cafeteria. It's nothing Jewish about it, but it's because it has this kind of lingering memory as the place that Jews went. But once you no longer have that anymore, once the quotas get lifted at elite universities, once it no longer is the case that as mainline Protestantism declines in America, it's no longer the case that to be a good American, you have to go to church, so Jews stop going to synagogue. We are witnessing the erosion of the assumption that I think is embedded in this question that the Jewish world doesn't like us or accept us. And I think the best data at that point is intermarriage. When you have 70 to 90% intermarriage in different parts of the country, the idea that the strongest indicator that you are welcome in a society is not that you want to intermarry. It's that non-Jews want to marry Jews. So I just don't think that it's true anymore. And I think that we are going to need to, I think that in our earlier period of Jewish history in America, the reason our institutions thrived was for reasons beyond our control. They had to. We were forced to. Now we have to offer something totally different, which is, what do we offer to our people to make them choose Judaism even though they don't have to? I think every rabbi in America goes to bed and wakes up thinking about this. What do I need to do to appeal to people, to make them want to choose my Judaism, to want to belong to a synagogue? I'm going to stay on this for one more second if I can. I know there's another question. I remember speaking to a senior rabbi of a major Reform congregation, a thriving congregation. He said to me, the most painful thing that happens every year is that it always comes back. They send out the membership letters, right? And every year, one of them comes back with the note written on the membership letter, not even like a separate letter, nothing, saying, we no longer require membership because we no longer need the services of the shul. That's usually code for, my kids have graduated. I finished bar mitzvah and confirmation. I no longer require the services of the shul. Do you know what that means? That means that the synagogue is functioning entirely in a transactional relationship. Like, I need it now, but I don't need it later. And he said, my job as a rabbi is to transform that relationship from transactional to meaningful. Right. You would never, that's the equivalent of breakup by text message. And I'm saying, like, at this moment in American Jewish history, all of our Judaism is going to be a matter of choice. Do people want it, opt into it, and feel that they maintain thick relationships through it? And we no longer can rely on simply that narrative of otherness or lack of acceptance in order to make for a serious Jewishness.
And I think that a number of the questions that have come in light of what you just said, Yehuda, how do you put the presence and the increasing presence of anti-Semitism into that formula?
Look, it makes me very anxious when anti-Semitism, there's almost like, I don't think people are saying this, but I hear it sometimes, there's almost a glee of like, this is the tool to get people to care about Jewishness again, because they're not really accepted anymore. Right. And I just don't, it's not going to work in the long run, because you could fight, another way to fight anti-Semitism in America doesn't have to be by going to shul, right? It could be by building allies with people of other faith communities. It could be by relinquishing your Jewishness. That's a great way to fight anti-Semitism. Be less visible. Don't go to shul. It's just a terrible play. So the fact that anti-Semitism persists, and usually, by the way, anti-Semitism, this is Dr. Deborah Lipstadt's viewpoint, usually anti-Semitism is also a witness to larger social ills. There are huge social ills in this country, and anti-Semitism is a kind of exhibition of some larger viruses that are present in our society. I just don't want it to be that we think that because of the return of anti-Semitism, we can put like our people are going to come running back to our shuls. We saw it last week. People said, go to shul this week because of Colleyville. So a bunch more, you got a spike in numbers. And I guarantee you, by the time we get to Vayakhel Pekude, those numbers are gone. So it just can't be the answer to how we think about what it means to create and market a serious Judaism in America.
But if I could just pursue that for one more moment.
Yeah.
I know I personally, I don't like to speak about anti-Semitism because that's that underlying thread for me always. I don't want people to come to the shul out of fear. I want them to come out of love. I want them to come out of dedication and commitment and pride and confidence in what they're doing. But at the same time, we're not just talking about coming to shul, we're talking about living a Jewish life. And as a number of people have said in their questions, whether it's belonging to, Hillcrest Country Club in Los Angeles, there's still something there that is so compelling and it's so worrisome at the same time that people, they can't shed, the non-Jewish world knows that we cannot shed our Judaism. And so there are lots of Jews in this country who are worried about anti-Semitism, not from the point of driving them to shul, but living. As you led us down that road last night, talking about the relationship between America and Israel. How do we square that? It seems like a tremendous challenge to us. You've focused our attention on the liberal approach to the lowering of barriers. But for so many, the barriers may have been lowered, but you're still them.
I think we as a community and as a people should be capable of doing two things at the same time. One is fighting against anti-Semitism to the best of our ability. And I don't mean simply defending against anti-Semitism. I don't mean simply putting ballistic windows in the synagogue or getting larger grants from Homeland Security to protect our synagogues. But I mean doing the things that actually fight against anti-Semitism. I thought the lawsuit in Charlottesville was a great example of this. Fight back. Bankrupt these guys, bankrupt American Nazis. That's what that lawsuit was about. It was the most positive approach towards fighting anti-Semitism I've seen in a long time, because it wasn't about putting on a Jewish star or ballistic windows. It was about actually fighting back. We should be able to do that. That is how we deal with the anti-Semitism challenge in America. But we're talking about something else here, which is how do you make a play for Jewish history where we can... Anti-Semitism is a problem created by anti-Semites. The more we spend time on it, the less we are doing all of the things that we as the Jewish people are supposed to do, which is to be a mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh, to be a nation of priests and a holy nation, to be a visionary people for the world. Zionism, by the way, is caught in the same trap right now. I find myself all the time spending so much time fighting off the antagonism and hatred towards the state of Israel, and not nearly enough time talking about why Zionism was the great Jewish people's project of imagination of our future. By the way, in the long run, what's going to compel the hearts and minds of our children and grandchildren is a story of Jewishness and Israel that inspires them, that appeals to them, that tells them that Jewishness is full of meaning and value and food and culture and music and poetry and theology, that it's an opening to all of those things. That's why we remain Jewish. And all I'm trying to do is make sure that we don't confuse one lane, which is fighting anti-Semitism, for the other lane, which is making the case of what a serious Jewish life in North America can look like. And I fear that in our there's too many institutional incentives to blur those two pieces together. And therefore, I wind up, instead of talking about what Jewishness should mean, I spend all of my time talking about being hated by others. I guarantee in the long run, that does not make a play, either for our children or grandchildren, but even for a claim to be a great Jewish community in history.
Thank you very much. Thank you for two wonderful presentations that made us truly think about where we sit today and our role and responsibility. Dr. Kurtzer, thank you for your thought-provoking presentations. We're so fortunate to add you to our collection of outstanding scholars who continue to honor the legacy of Arnie Sweet and his beloved family. We turn to you, our scholars, to challenge us, to question our positions, to help us refine our understanding of the world around us and our place and responsibility to that world. We have been honored to have you address this subject for us last night and today, and we are so privileged to have your presence on our screens, both last night and today, and to leave us with so much to consider. I want to share with everyone in conclusion this wonderful description of a moment that was that will stay with our community here in Dallas for a long time, that involved your father, Yehuda. And Marlene Gorin, a wonderful member of our community and a leader for so many years, shared with us that years ago, it could be 15, your father was the guest of the Dallas JCRC for our community-wide celebration of Yom HaAtzmaut. And he gave the community-wide lecture on Israel to over 800 attendees. The next day, the JCRC arranged to have Daniel Kurtzer meet with the World Affairs Council at their luncheon. After his talk, all 350 movers and shakers in Dallas who were present stood up and applauded. The World Affairs Council director said that no one in their history had received such a standing ovation. And indeed, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. It's been our honor to have you this afternoon and last night to share with us your thoughts on our Jewish American predicament and challenge and opportunity. And on behalf of all of us, and especially this sweet family, we thank you for being our scholar in residence this year and honoring Arnie Sweet's memory in such a significant way. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us.